Hello, today this is starting a first video on Western music history. I am going to be making future videos on the music theory and the styles of music around the whole world in the future. So if you're interested in learning more about the music from other places, then do definitely check those out. But for today, starting off, it's a timeline beginning in the medieval period of how Western music developed. Within the scope of music theory, the time period that gets classified as medieval begins in the 6th century. During the medieval period, monophonic music was very common, where there was one melodic line. There wouldn't be a tone center to it, and there wouldn't be chords supporting it. The song itself was this single line. Now, there was also polyphonic music. Today, when we hear music, generally there is a melody and there's a supporting chord structure underneath it that grounds where the melody is and gives a sense of where its home tone is. While in medieval Western music, if there were multiple voices playing at once or multiple instruments, there wouldn't be a chord structure getting built. And instead, more often you would hear either the same melody being played by both instruments, though perhaps an interval apart. Common would be a third apart from each other or a fourth apart from each other. And sometimes you would also hear two separate melodies being played at once as well, that would sometimes clash with each other. At least clash to our ears now, where we're used to this harmonically supported sound, where in medieval music, the melodies themselves were the core focus without any of that support. Liturgical music was enormous in the medieval period, with quite a lot of the music being created being written for choir, performed in churches, cathedrals, monasteries. There was secular and popular music as well, very often being written for dances or as folk music. A lot of the theory and conventions underlying Western music that we have today wasn't there during the medieval period, although quite a lot of the beginnings can be found during the medieval period. In the high medieval period, we begin to see examples of what would end up developing into the system of music notation that we have now. The Renaissance period begins in the 15th century, and what we can really see stand out in this period is that there is much more complexity that begins to emerge, and we start to see something that resembles what we would find familiar in the modern music period. At this point, we begin to see much more polyphonic complexity, and we start to see an underlying harmonic structure begin to emerge. Instead of just simple melodies and maybe another part playing it an interval away, we begin to see much more interplay between the different voices. And this is really the emergence of chord progressions, where underneath the melody, there are a set of changing chords that drive the harmonic progression. Music was frequently written for masses at this point. However, we do start to see an increase in secular music as well, very often written for dances or performances or just as folk songs. Interest in music widely expanded as secular music grew and it became more intertwined with people's lives. We begin to see increased technique developed and also more instruments begin to emerge at this point. Some instruments of the era were the harp, the lyre, the shawm, and the emergence of the organ. Songs still popular today came from this period. This time had musicians like John Dunstable, Giovanni di Palestrina, and John Dowland. The Baroque period is generally considered to begin around the beginning of the 17th century, and here we get just a massive explosion of ornate grandeur and complexity. Baroque music is very dense, stylized, has a lot of ornamentation to it. During this period, we start to see counterpoint become really sophisticated, with complex lines being woven between multiple parts. Baroque music was often composed and performed for masses, but also social events. We increasingly see this genre begin to be applied to dramatic performances and comedy for the stage. An early version of what is generally the modern string instruments of violin, viola, cello, and bass emerge at this time, as well as the harpsichord and the more modern pipe organ. More standardized forms also began to develop at this time, with styles like the gavotte and the gigue and the minuet and sarabande, which sometimes will be played together as part of the Baroque suite. Some notable musical figures of the time are Johann Sebastian Bach, Jean Baptiste Lully, and Antonio Vivaldi. Galant, coming from the French galant, is this sort of in the middle period between Baroque and Classical, and there are different terms for the music that arose around this time, but this is sort of the transition period. Now, I don't want to describe this just like it is some vague period between the two styles. It had very characteristic elements of its own. Arising in the 18th century, it has many similarities to the Baroque style. It still used complex polyphony and was still ornate in many respects, but was a bit of a response to that, where you start seeing more simplicity, less ornate grandeur and complexity, and more of a focus on a core melody in this more simplified Baroque-like style. We start to see a lot of the groundwork of what will become classical emerge. Many of the great musical figures of this period exist on either side, being thought of as Baroque composers, classical composers, or in some cases, composers of both styles. Some notable figures of this era are Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, Jean-Philippe Rameau, and Frederick the Great, as in Frederick the Great. Yes, this guy. Or to quote the Habsburgs, the Prussian king who some call great. The classical period is considered to begin in the mid-18th century, and here that trend towards simplification, playing a very clear melody that's backed up by chord changes, really come to fruition. There's this overall aesthetic cultural trend of classicism going on at the time, which looks toward the classical period in antiquity, and takes from that trends in music, architecture, art, and theater. We see popular music and public performance grow, as music is now driven by a more sentimental, sensitive approach. While a more clear melody without dense counterpoint becomes more present in the classical period, we also start to see a lot more exploration in other areas, particularly in the increased use of key changes. The use of much wider dynamics picks up at this point, along with shorter, clearer phrases and more harmonic support as opposed to the counterpoint that was seen earlier. Some very modern leaps that happened as well were that equal temperament started to become much more widely adopted, and a new instrument rises pretty rapidly to prominence, the forte piano, which, with some modifications over the years, has become the piano that we now know. Some notable figures from this period were Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Franz Joseph Haydn, and Ludwig van Beethoven. Romantic music appears in the 19th century as a wider cultural trend of romanticism begins to pick up. We see more senses of nature, the supernatural, and things that depict a more, well, romantic sense of the world. We see more popular public performances and a massive increase in the size of orchestras, with long symphonies and operas being performed. Dynamics get even wider as these very large orchestras are able to output an enormous amount of sound, while simultaneously, a chunk of the music being written is extremely quiet and delicate and sentimental. During this time, too, nationalist sentiment rose across Europe, and composers tried to find a real national sound. They tried to put the sound of their homes in the music quite often, attempting to portray in song their cultural identity. We see a lot more chromatic music during this time and atonality. At times we see a willingness to drastically depart from the key. During this time we see figures like Franz Liszt, Richard Wagner, and Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Well, that's all for part 1. If you're interested in part 2, then please do see that. If you're interested in music theory in general, then do subscribe. And until then, have a fine day.